Greetings, this is the Questing GM and this is RPG A Day 2020, day 25, and the word of the day is lever. When we think lever in a fantasy role-playing context, we obviously think of the typical trap, the ultimate activation button for a trap. You know, you put a lever in the dungeon and it's almost the first instinct of a player to want to pull it, and then some will obviously warn caution against it. And it gets more interesting when you put more than one lever and you get to see where they want to take it with, but usually involves one of them getting pulled eventually at some point. But I think for this video, and I think something we can talk a bit more interesting, is the idea of gaining leverage, which where the word lever comes in as well. I talked about this in the edge video, that players will always try to find an edge, and one of the most favorite methods that they have is obviously trying to gain leverage on typically in role-playing encounters, or in, you know, when negotiation of their services to go on the quest that you have prepared as GM. This is like the most typical behavior that as a GM you have to really wrestle with, you know, on a very constant basis, especially if you are going on the paradigm that, you know, the GM preps the adventure and offers the freedom of choice to players to do whatever they want in the role-playing game. One of the virtues of role-playing game, the freedom of choice to do whatever they want. Then players choosing not to do what is exactly that you've prepared. And, you know, if you were a very heavy-handed GM, or you had very heavy-handed players, then the leverage will have, you know, someone who's going to be using that leverage against each other, whether the GM against the players or the players against the GM. Although if you look at, you know, if you read threads and you read forums, you know, some players will probably complain that for a GM to use leverage on the players is totally unfair, but it's totally fair game that the players can do the same to the GM. So that's another topic that maybe, you know, let's not try to get too negative for RPG A Day. But it's something to think about. Why is it that as a GM we want our players to do something that we want? Why do we have to resort to using leverage? Then, you know, there can be different ways we can get players to do what they want, but the fact that we always have something in mind for them to do, but never actually tell them to do it, or never actually give them reasons to do it, just because we want to keep that facade of freedom of choice when, you know, actually they have no choice. It's more of an illusion of choice. As I said, depending on how it's used and how it's presented, and or how the players take choice that's been given to them, whether real or not, it becomes a struggle. It becomes a conflict between player and GM. That's where, you know, players and GMs will probably use very underhanded tactics to get each other to do what the other wants. Why do we have to resort to using leverage? Whether it's, you know, to get the players to go on the rails that you have set for them, or, you know, or whether it's a way for the players to communicate to the GM. They say, I want to do things on my own terms, and partly it's your responsibility as a GM to make sure that, you know, my demands are met. If this is going to be the premise of why things happen in role-playing games, then I think there's something not quite right in the expectations or the assumptions of both players and GMs and their roles in getting together and playing a role-playing game. This is not something that has to be a problem. Doesn't have to resort to the stage of using leverage. This is something that can be communicated and can be agreed upon, you know, way early in advance. If your game has to function on levers, you know, on gaining leverage on each other, I think the game has to go back to the drawing board. The group has to go back to the drawing board and figure things out of why things happen the way it is. Could it be a difference in expectations, in what is the GM supposed to present and in what is the player supposed to do? Is there a different dynamic, or is there a different relationship that the GM is presenting to the players that the players was not expecting, and therefore they're trying to protect themselves? It could be vice versa, where, you know, the players are thinking that they are doing something that is relatively smart for them to do. You know, that's what my character would do, that sort of argument. But it's on the expense of maybe the dignity of the GM, in a sense that the GM is being forced to improvise or to provide something that they otherwise wouldn't have presented, but because the players, you know, are sneakily maybe using some defenses or justifications to say that, hey, you as a GM are not playing your end of the bargain that we are supposed to be getting. So maybe this sounds a little negative, you know, as a topic, but I think my point is, the moment leverage comes in, and it's not something that either side appreciates to being levered upon. I think that's something that's a symptom, that's a sign of something that's going wrong in the game or in the group. And it's something that has to be really brought out in the open to really communicate and discuss. So I guess that would be all for day 25. It is a relatively tough topic, but as I've already mentioned, that this is something that I've already talked a little bit on edge. It's a matter of how you address it, how you handle it, and what are what are the kind of problems that you're trying to avoid, and the proper solution to come to that. But I think on a general scale, it comes down to being on the same page and not using leverage against each other. So that'll be all for RPG a day 25 for the word lever, and I will see you on day 26.